You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here. My name is Sasha Pippenger. I'll be your moderator today. On behalf of the U.S. Institute of Peace and also our co-host Conciliation Resources, a big welcome to those of you that made it to the room today, but also to the many of you that are joining us online. For those of you that are new to USIP, we're a nonpartisan independent institute founded by Congress. Our work is centered around the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible and practical and also in the interest of US and global security. I direct the Peace Processes team here at USIP, and we're responsible for the Institute's work on mediation, but also negotiation, ceasefires, reconciliation, and dialogue. The foundation of our discussion today is a publication. It's the 30th issue of the Accord Review that's entitled Still Time to Talk, Adaptation and Innovation in Peace Mediation. A few words. For those of us that work on peace processes, there's no question that mediation is one of our most efficacious tools we have in international peacemaking. And we also know that all of those global dynamics that are transforming armed conflict and geopolitics are causing the entire ecosystem to shift underneath our feet. So whether it's climate change or polarization or disruptive technologies, those same forces that are impacting all elements of our world are also generating implications and also arguably some opportunities for peace mediation. So for that reason, we're really excited to convene today's discussion, to have a chance to get some really great minds together and untangle some of those threads and put a spotlight on some of the challenges that are arising in this field, and also spend some time considering what opportunities that opens up and how it impacts our shared interest in establishing durable settlements. I'd also like to wish everyone a very happy Halloween. I, for one, would have liked us to come here in a group costume. I thought maybe we could have been the principles of international mediation, and Tyler over there with the security clearance could have been confidentiality. Teresa, I think, would have done a really good impartiality. I could have done do no harm, but strangely that idea didn't get much buy-in. So nonetheless, with or without any holiday spirit, we're so glad to have you here for what we really expect to be a great discussion. Before I introduce the truly stellar lineup we have, let me give you just a very quick rundown of what to expect with us. Each of our experts today is approaching the questions I just mentioned around international mediation and how it's transforming from a different angle. So each of them is going to give a few minutes of initial remarks, but we've really reserved a bulk of the time today to have an interactive question and answer period with you, the participants in the room. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our lineup. To my left, we have Alexander Ramsbotham. He is the Director of Research and Innovation at Conciliation Resources. Conciliation Resources is, of course, our co-host today, as I mentioned, and is also the publisher of the Accord volume that inspired today's discussion. To his left, we have Teresa Whitfield. She is the issue editor of that Accord volume. She's also an associate at Conciliation Resources, a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. From 2016 to 2022, she was the director of the Policy and Mediation Division at the United Nations Division for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And she's also a really valued advisor to our Peace Processes team here at USIP. To her left is Yun Sun. She is the director of the China program at the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C., and she's been working on China's role in conflict mediation since 2012. Then we have Sean Kane. He's the team leader of the UN Mediation Support Unit, where he oversees the provision of mediation advice to UN entities and external partners. He's also worked at several other mediation organizations, including HD in Libya and also here at USIP, so it's great to have him back in the building. To his left is Meredith Preston McGhie. She's currently the Secretary General for the Global Center on Pluralism. She was formerly the head of the Africa program for the Center of Humanitarian Dialogue. I'll say in that role she had a lot of demanding responsibilities, but chief among them was being my boss 10 years ago. So we're really glad she survived that and is able to be here today. And she continues to advise a number of peace processes and teaches peace process design internationally. And last but certainly not least, on our far end is Tyler Thompson, who has come to us from across the street. He is a senior advisor in the Negotiation Support Unit at the US Department of State. Very valued colleague to my team here, and in fact, he previously worked here on our peace process team at USIP, but also at USAID, at the Public Law and International Policy Group, and he served as a strategic advisor for both state and non-state parties on international law, peace negotiation, ceasefires, and post-conflict transitions. I will say that many people on this panel hold many hats, and several of them are speaking to you in their own personal capacities and not on behalf of their organizations. So with that, I will pass over to Zand and let him tell you a little bit more about why we're here today.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and a big thank you to USIP for co-convening this event with us. I also should say thanks to the Swiss and British governments for supporting this project and working with us on it. And thank you all for coming as well. It's really nice to see people here, and hello to people online as well. Yeah, so my name's Alexander Ramsbotham, Zand for short, and I work at Conciliation Resources. CR is primarily a practice organisation. We work with different communities and peacemakers in societies affected by violent conflict to support their peace efforts. I stress that because that really informs and forms the research and analysis work that we do, that it's really practice-based and practice-focused, and we want it to be useful for policymakers and peace practitioners, and a contribution to the community and to the development of learning in that area. As Sasha mentioned, this is the 30th issue of Accord. It's also the 30th year of CR, so it's a double milestone for us, and an important sort of moment in the development of the organisation. And I think this particular publication is a really valuable marker, and really lives up to the billing of being our 30th issue. Accord is a vehicle that we have to develop peace learning and peace practice. It's our 30th edition as well as our 30th year, as I mentioned, and it was one of the first things that CR did, was to produce an Accord publication. We have a lot of contributions in an Accord publication. This particular one has at least 30. They're short, so they're accessible. You don't have to read the whole thing. You can dip in and out of it, and I hope it's easy to navigate. But it also, we put an emphasis on contributions by people who are really involved in peace processes. So there's quite an array of different contributions in there, from established academics to peace practitioners, women's activists, and senior diplomats. So it's a real spread and quite a geographic spread, and that really complicates the editorial process, but it adds to the richness of the analysis, and I think is a real key part of it. For this particular project, we felt that mediation was under a lot of stress. We are obviously supporters of mediation, but we're realistic that it was under stress in a number of different ways, which Sasha has already mentioned to you. So we wanted to do something on peace mediation, and particularly thinking that in some areas peace mediation hasn't kept up with some of the contemporary challenges of armed conflict and geopolitics. And so we've really explored that and tried to identify some priorities and some areas for adaptation and innovation in peace mediation that we hope will be useful in taking the field forward. So yeah, a big thank you to lots of people here have contributed to the project in lots of different ways. So it's really a treat to be up here with everybody and to be part of this conversation. So I think that's enough for me, and I can hand over.
Wonderful. Now we'll turn to Teresa, who is editor of this volume. I think is probably in a good position to give an overview of some of the messages and insights that are collected therein, and sort of distill some of the recommendations that came out of it.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you to USIP. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Talking and thinking about peace mediation has never been more necessary or more difficult. And there were moments during the year and a half or so which we were working on the Accord volume where it seemed that things just kept getting worse. We were working on it when war broke out in Sudan in April 2023, and then October the 7th happened, and everything seemed to get worse the whole time. However, it didn't make me feel that we needed to throw in the towel or throw in the towel on mediation. On the contrary, it was, I think, a real underlined the urgency of addressing what is certainly a crisis in peacemaking, but perhaps not such a crisis in mediation as a tool. I think in an effort to look anew at what we know and have learned and think again about what needs to be adapted and adapt further for the future, it also requires recognizing that mediation is a potent but quite limited tool. It's essential in some circumstances and can be helpful in others. But when parties are convinced that they still have much to gain by military means, even a trusted mediator will not be able to move them from this course, especially in the absence of compelling external leverage. And this is a hard reality which I think we all work within. So at this moment, we see that mediation is conditioned by a lot of external factors: the complexity of the surrounding geopolitical environment, conflicts themselves, which are characterized by a multiplicity of armed actors, the increasing internationalization of internal armed conflicts, which brings different interests and powers and money and weapons and political influence sloshing about in ways that complicates the conflict's resolution, at the same time as the dramatic return of interstate conflict, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, but threatened in other places, as we've seen with the escalation in the Middle East. And all of this against the background, as Sasha mentioned, of rapidly evolving systemic threats, including climate change and the various impacts of digital technologies. And the mediation field, against this very complicated background, the mediation field itself is also complicated and fragmented. There are multiple mediators or potential mediators, from multilateral actors to regional and sub-regional organizations, a very wide range of states and private mediators and NGOs, all of which bring different assets, ambitions, worldviews, and interests in some cases to the peacemaking space. Putting all of this together and all the different elements and actors that make up today's conflicts into a kind of single peace process that might conclude with a comprehensive peace agreement has become nearly impossible. In fact, it's been 10 years or so since the last big comprehensive peace agreements in Colombia and the Philippines. One article in the magazine in the Accord by Christine Bell instead coins the idea of what she calls multi-mediation, where multiple streams and levels of mediation and dialogue are taking place through ad hoc initiatives across different contexts and organizations within a single conflict area. Such processes bring with them really serious challenges for both coherence and the sustainability, and force us to rethink a number of our tools. The Accord volume, and some of you I see have copies, and there are more copies outside, and we do encourage you to take them away, partly because they're really heavy, so we don't want to take any more back with us. But it concludes with 10 recommendations, not all of which will be applicable in every context. I'll quickly run through them before passing on to my colleagues. The first one is something that I wouldn't have thought necessary to say if we'd been doing this 6 or 10 years ago, but I think is very necessary now, which is the importance of prioritizing the pursuit of political solutions as the primary objective in strategies to tackle armed conflict. Negotiated solutions are always hard and often contentious, and working towards them requires political courage and skill and tenaciousness and a lot of patience. It also requires recognizing that while the outcome of a conflict will be determined by military dynamics, a sustainable solution must rest on a political settlement. It's difficult, and we see it particularly in the mesh of conflicts that have entwined numbers of external actors involved. If you look at the range of conflicts across the north of Africa, through the Sahel to the Horn and to the Middle East, many different states are involved in different configurations in all those conflicts. And too often, supporting a peace process or calling for peace in a country like Sudan can be relegated as just one amongst a number of bilateral goals. And unfortunately, reaching peace is so difficult in these circumstances that if reaching peace in Sudan or caring about the fate of the civilian population in Syria is priority number 6, it's not going to happen. The second recommendation is to pursue mediation below and beyond the state. This means welcoming the value of local processes and important work on building coherence within conflict parties. Some of this work's happening in contexts such as Sudan and South Sudan and Yemen at the moment, even if the conditions are not given for full negotiations. Meanwhile, beyond the state, a lot of the systemic factors like climate change, but also criminal economies and commercial trade, which impact on conflict dynamics, can only be addressed in beyond the state in a regional or international manner. In such difficult times, I think the volume considers that we need to redefine success. Big peace agreements may be hard to achieve, but we can still recognize specific or localized gains that can make people safer, reduce violence, and support momentum to a sustainable peace. These might be ceasefires or other forms of partial agreements, but they also bring with them challenges. While working on them, we have to remember that the ultimate goal is long-term, and that short-term, partial or transactional agreements need to be matched with long-term thinking and helping the parties prepare for a better future in the years ahead. Fourth recommendation is to forge partnerships of different kinds between diverse mediators to help balance their skills and interests, avoid competition, and maximize their collective impact. This, of course, is easier said than done. There's no single partnership model, but the successful examples, and there are several in the publication. There's an interesting article on collaboration and coordination in the Horn of Africa, which points to both success and failure in this area. And it also argues that the success is dependent on leadership to build a degree of conceptual clarity on how a peace process can move forward. Related, a fifth point is that we need to build consensus amongst diverse mediators around core peacemaking values and principles. Again, not at all easy in this very polarized world. This will mean acknowledging and not wishing away differences in goals and worldviews, but also finding ways to reaffirm consensus on international law, sovereignty, and national ownership, and supporting initiatives to build trust amongst mediators, even when they might have different approaches and goals. Sixth, and this is my costume moment, but defending impartiality, I unfortunately don't know what, wasn't given that challenge directly. But in mediation, in peace processes, different mediators or peace actors bring different interests, resources, and ambitions. In almost all processes, external leverage of some kind is needed, and often the US is called to bring it. But even then, there is a need for impartial mediators who can work more closely with the parties, building trust with them and between them, and helping them manage their own process, sometimes reframing difficult issues or expanding their imagination towards a different future. A seventh is an urgent need to support engagement with non-state armed groups. It's a sobering fact that according to the ICRC in 2023, there were some 200 million people living in territories that were controlled or contested by non-state armed groups. Of course, the nature of the armed state groups varies, the non-state armed groups varies enormously across their goals, political, ideological, some of them economic, and their use of tactics. Some use terrorist tactics as a matter of course. But early engagement may not always be possible for reasons of security, and it may not always be desirable for reasons of political legitimacy. But if we're going to resolve conflicts, we need to think about how to do it and who can best do it. Sometimes it might be humanitarian actors or NGOs who are in better positions to assess the possibility of further engagement down the road. An eighth recommendation is to encourage and enable inclusion, emphasizing its tactical and strategic value in generating momentum and achieving a more sustainable peace, as well as the rights-based arguments on which it rests. There's several articles in the volume which address inclusion in different ways, and Meredith, who will speak to this more, was a really valued advisor across this area of the work. And one of the things that we point to is the extent to which we've all learnt over the years from the innovation, adaptation, lessons learned, some good, some bad, from the Women, Peace and Security agenda. There's also an excellent article in the volume by Julie Hawke looking at how digital technologies can enhance inclusion often, in different ways and different processes, usually in a hybrid mix of digital and in real person kind of engagements. A ninth point is the need, perhaps self-evident, to upskill mediators to keep pace with the changing world. The professionalization of mediation has come a long way over the years, and the USIP is an organization that has played a really important role in this area through its publications and through its work and through its devotion to learning. However, we still have work to do on core skills and to match the existing skills that the mediation community has built up to the processes when and as needed. And we also need to be thinking about expanding and adapting our expertise to new subjects, climate change being one, digital technologies, pandemics, the kind of now new forms of conflict taking place in the commercial realm, and the sense that many of these issues are intertwined. The economic aspects and agendas within conflict is an area which I think the mediation field has struggled to integrate properly. Finally, do no harm, a principle which needs extra vigilance in a time of dramatic global change. Mediators can at times get carried away with the processes they're involved in, but they must not put those with whom they engage or support in danger, or undertake actions which might worsen divisions or exacerbate or entrench power inequalities. They should always be aware of unintended consequences and have the humility to stand back or step down or change a course of strategy if they appear to be heading into trouble. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Teresa. And I think one of the things the publication does really nicely is really underscore how many different sorts of forces are acting on this space. And one of those forces that gets referenced in the publication is that not only do you have a new context and practices of mediation, but you have this new cast of characters. And one of the most intriguing of those cast of new characters that's become increasingly active in this space is, of course, China. And so, Yoon, I know that you've studied China's engagement in this space for a very long time. Maybe we'll invite you in to give some of your thoughts from that perspective.
Sure, thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Zen, thank you, Teresa, for amazingly fast editorial process for the publication.
Almost because your draft was so good.
Oh,
see what others went through.
It was so fast. It was like, wow, the book is already out. Okay. Yeah, we need that kind of efficiency in the peace and mediation field, so it's really appreciated. I'll make some observations about China's role in the mediation process. Just some distinctions and some definitions about the characteristics of the Chinese type of mediation. And it's quite different from the Western definition of mediation. There's some similarities, but there's a lot of distinctions. The first one, well, we all know that China is a relatively new player in this field because traditionally, if you look at the trajectory of the Chinese global involvement, before year 2000, China was not really very much involved in the, for example, conflict areas. The economic desire to engage these areas or these countries are relatively low. So it really started to pick up speed starting the year 2000 when China launched the famous Going Out campaign for Chinese companies to go out to engage the global resources and global markets. And that's when the Chinese realized that they are inevitably bogged down in some of the worst conflicts worst conflict zones in the world. If we look at China's role played in conflict mediation, looks at the substance, it's really more facilitation rather than mediation. Just to give you some examples of the role that China plays, China has played the role of convener. For example, Afghan Taliban before 2021 and the Ghani government. China has played the role of host hosted a meeting for Taliban, hosted a meeting in about the Myanmar, the Burma civil war. They hosted parties, for example, from the Syria civil war. They also hosted the well-known six-party talks on North Korea. So they have no problem playing the role of host. They also play the role of facilitator, trying to promote facilitated communications among different parties of the conflicts and try to convey messages. Here's a demand from this side, here's a demand of that side. They have played the role of endorser or guarantor of the, in very specific cases. 2015, nationwide ceasefire accord in Myanmar, the Chinese signed as one of the guarantors. And more recently, in 2023, the Saudi-Iran deal, the Chinese also signed as a guarantor. But beyond these 5 roles, convener, facilitator, endorser, host, and guarantor, you don't see China really gets involved in the agenda setting. They don't involve themselves as for what the issues needs to be negotiated and how they should be negotiated, and they don't mediate on the content, the substance of the conflict resolution, which sometimes is cited as the largest weakness of China's approach. Because if you're not getting involved in the substance, you're not really mediating. You are facilitating a process which by itself is important, but in order to promote a resolution, that is far from being enough. And we also look at China's mediation effort, China's effort as more process-oriented rather than result-oriented. Like Teresa talked about, these are exceedingly difficult processes. They have had decades, if not longer, grievances and history embedded in them. So for China to keep the process going is, for them, is a higher priority, sometimes compared to having a much more glorious goal that cannot be achieved. So that brings the question, why does China get involved in these? One, there's an innate need. China as a global investor, as a global economic engagement expands in all areas, including some of the conflict areas. Well, 53% of China's crude oil comes from Middle East, so China's interest is deeply embedded in the local peace and stability. And there's also a positive correlation between the geographical distance between the conflict and China and the level of the Chinese involvement. Naturally, if a conflict is on its border, Chinese are much more vested in this process. There's also an element of preventing Western, especially US involvement in conflicts on China's border. And we see this most in the case of Myanmar. The 2015 nationwide ceasefire accord, the Chinese made sure that the U.S. does not participate as it participated as a witness, but U.S. did not get to sign the NCA agreement because China was vehemently opposing it. Last but not least, I would say for the Chinese diplomacy, there's an element seeing conflict mediation and China's seat at the table as one manifestation of China's great power status. It can be absent. People talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Well, where is China? What is China's position? You call yourself a global responsible stakeholder. Where are you absent from the picture? Which is why that coming to the current Gaza crisis, and I was interviewed for on China's role in this. I would say, well, it's the most striking fact is China's absence from the mediation process. So great power status. What is China's strengths as a mediator or as a facilitator? I would say China's strength comes from the power of relationships. We're talking about non-state actors. We're talking about governments that are not necessarily welcomed by the Western countries. China has a relationship with all these. So it's not necessarily because China has an agenda to pursue, but by the pure value of their relationship with players that sometimes are not engaged by the Western mediators. China does have a power of position, a power of relationships. And in terms of the incentives, another characteristics of the Chinese mediation is that China does not provide a negative incentive, meaning that if you don't participate, we're going to sanction you. We're going to put economic sanction on you. They do provide positive incentives, but not directly. Post-conflict reconstruction is always a talking point in the Chinese mediation. If you can end the conflict, well, here's what economic engagement will look like and post-conflict reconstruction. And we've seen this in the case democracy in conflict resolution or conflict mediation, the need for minority rights, the need for federalism in a lot of cases, the need for women's rights, and the protection of women, the gender issue and security, let alone the newer issues like cyber and climate change. I find those are completely missing from the Chinese narrative. So instead, I think the Chinese would rely on unofficial, indirect, tacit influence to reach deals under the table that do not have anything to do with those principles that Western mediators would enshrine as the indispensable elements of conflict resolution. For example, you look at China's, the Saudi-Iran deal, which is pretty much the only success story, I would say, so far in China's mediation effort. None of the Western values is really reflected in there, right? And another example is that, we talk about the Afghan Taliban regime these days and how women's rights or women's education is a core issue for the Western community. And the Chinese position is that, women's issues are important, inclusiveness is important, but that is not the origin of the conflict. Therefore, it should not be a prerequisite for the engagement with Afghan Taliban regime either. So there are these fundamental differences in terms of the values that are embedded in the mediation. The Chinese have confidence or have the adherence to this unofficial, tacit maneuvering, relationship building, manipulation, then basically to whip a deal into shape based on their relationships, but it's not necessarily founded on certain principles of inclusiveness, democratic rights, democratic election, federalism. So all those are missing. So some success, I would say the Saudi-Iran deal has been the one example of victory by China as a new mediator, but much less concrete deliverables from other examples. But then that goes back to the Chinese point that, these are about processes, that the results are difficult and nobody else has been successful. So why is China being treated differently? So there's some distinct logic that goes on with the Chinese mediation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yoon. I think it's such an important reminder to all of us in this field that the very meaning of mediation depends enormously on whose mouth the word is coming out of. And beyond that, that in this age of mediation, that it's the desire to be a mediator or act as a mediator is increasingly just inextricable from a national foreign policy, whether it's questions of economics or global ambitions on the international stage. Thank you. Turning to Sean, from where you sit, for better or for worse, you have a very unvarnished view on the front lines of some of these processes to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of how these processes are changing. So I was wondering if you could share with us just some of your reflections from that and what dynamics you see emerging.
Thank you, Sasha. And I think after listening to Yoon, I actually have lots of questions I'd like to ask, but I'll stick to my topic, but I'm really going to focus just on one topic, which was the subject matter of the article that I drafted with two colleagues, Govinda Clayton and Maud Morrison, for the Accord volume. And that was really the way in which digital technologies are playing a greater role in armed conflict. They're also playing a greater role in diplomacy, greater role in politics, and therefore a feeling we had that they should also be playing a greater role in mediation processes. And indeed, we've started to see conflict parties during peace negotiations try to integrate digital issues into the process. And I want to be careful here to distinguish this from the use of digital tools to try to improve the quality of processes. So Teresa mentioned another article in the volume by Julie Hawk on the use of digital technologies to improve inclusion in processes. So for example, digital consultations, different ways to use these tools so that groups that are hard to reach physically, groups which may be marginalized, groups that may have safety concerns about participating in person can join a process. I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to try to focus on is something that I think is a newer development, which relates to the parties actually trying to negotiate restraints on harmful digital behaviors as part of a peace agreement and part of a peace process. And this is very much the analog to what we see, if you like, in the traditional offline world. During a set of peace talks, parties will try to address offline drivers of conflict. They'll try to address offline harmful behaviors by the parties towards each other, and offline military tactics which harm civilians. Of course, all these things can now happen online, and so the question is, can you negotiate digital constraints as part of the peace process? And we have actually seen a number of social media peace agreements, including those brokered by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, as well as digital clauses appearing in other types of agreements. And so our feeling was that this demonstrates both the utility, but also the possibility of trying to negotiate these restraints. I want to be clear that I'm not taking an advocacy approach when talking about digital clauses in peace agreements. I'm not trying to say that they should appear in all peace agreements or be front and center in every process. It should, as always, be dependent on the wishes of the parties, the content they wish to see addressed, or when a mediator, when they're doing their conflict analysis, sees this as a fundamental driver, feel it's necessary to achieve the goal of the process or to implement their mandate. But we were aware in writing this that the word digital technology is very broad. Words like social media, cyber, AI can mean many different things, are often not well defined. So the first thing we set out to do in the article was to look at three main categories of uses of digital technology that we see as sort of possible subjects for negotiation. So the first is offensive cyber operations. And this, as a very kind of quick rule of thumb definition, is the use of a combination of technological, financial, human resources to gain unauthorized access into an adversary, into a military opponent's digital services and networks, with the goal of perhaps denying them access or use of those services, or damaging the infrastructure that these networks and systems operate. It tends to be we tend to see these type of tactics used either in international, interstate armed conflict, or in the so-called gray zone of below the threshold of war between adversarial states. And the reason for this is, particularly at the high end of these capabilities, it tends to be state actors that have these capacities, but also in terms of choosing who to target, it makes sense to use these capacities against another actor that operates significant amounts of digital networks. So that's often also a state. So that's the sort of first category. One very obvious, prominent current day example of that is, of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine, where the Cyber Peace Institute has documented hundreds of attacks, cyber attacks, by both sides since February 2022. The second category of uses of digital technology in conflict, which we concentrated upon, is something which we call network control. So if cyber operations is getting unauthorized access to someone else's networks, network control is making use of your own networks to deny access of them to your opponents. And this typically means national telecommunications and internet services that are administrated, operated by either governments or de facto authorities. And it takes the form of things like internet shutdowns or telecommunication shutdowns. And again, so if cyber operations are largely happening in interstate conflict, these are largely happening in domestic civil wars, where shutting down, usually in a targeted geographic area where the conflict or fighting is happening, shutting down access to telecommunications, to the internet, denies the ability of non-state armed groups to make use of these technologies for their own communications, to do things like operate drones, to use GIS systems, to target mortars and indirect fire, to fundraise, to pay salaries. And so it can confer a tactical military advantage, but it obviously has a very substantial impact on civilians. Everyone living in that area is denied access, to these services, which are at the heart of things like education, banking, the economy, access in some case to health services. It impedes the activities of humanitarian actors. So a very kind of important, and I think key to realize, increasingly prevalent tactic. There's an NGO called Access Now. In 2023, they documented 74 shutdowns in active conflict zones in 9 different countries. This is more than double the number of shutdowns they documented in 2022. So quite widespread and increasing quite quickly. The third category of technologies, which we address in the article, and which is one I think everyone in the room is familiar with, but we call influence and manipulation operations. And so this is really using social media, network, or WhatsApp, messenger services to try to disrupt an opponent's decision-making or influence local, domestic, and international narratives around the conflict. These types of operations can also be used to directly target a peace process by spreading mis or disinformation to undermine its legitimacy, to directly target perhaps the mediator, to potentially target often women negotiators in the process, but to kind of disrupt the peace process. So these are the three types of technologies we felt were increasingly prevalent and possible to negotiate restraints on. And I'll close by just sort of noting that we've already started to see agreements across these three spaces. The most frequent are on the social media issues. We found 12 cases of agreements that were either social media agreements or broader agreements that had clauses on social media in 10 different countries. Interestingly, quite a range of types of agreements, from ceasefires, local peace agreements at the subnational level, or prevention type agreements ahead of elections on sort of acceptable behaviors by political parties. On the network of control, the most prominent example we found was the 2022 permanent cessation of hostilities in Tigray. From 2020 to 2022, Tigray had been under a 2-year internet and telecommunications shutdown, at that time one of the longest in the world. The Tigrayan People's Liberation Front had sought to put the issue of lifting the telecommunications shutdown onto the negotiating agenda. Interestingly, there was a civil society campaign directed at the African Union, which is the mediator of the ceasefire agreement, to also include this issue in the peace talks. And it did, the ceasefire agreement did ultimately include a provision on restoration of services, including internet and telecommunications. And within 3 months of the agreement being signed, services have been restored to 27 towns and cities in Tigray, which kind of demonstrates these agreements can be a mechanism to try to address these things. Finally, in the cyber realm, there's obviously less of a track record recently of international peace agreements, so less, or international peace treaties, so less agreements to point to. But what we have seen outside of conflict is adversarial states negotiating either bilateral agreements or memorandums of understanding specifically on cyber. And these often take a confidence-building liaison communications transparency approach to manage incidents, so that if there is an incident between states, there's a way to try to resolve it without it escalating to further incidents or causing offline activity. And we think that could be a model one might see in future international peace treaties as relates to cyber. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Teresa had mentioned in her remarks that one of the ways that we as practitioners need to rise to the challenge of this evolving mediation ecosystem is to upskill our mediators. And I think you've just provided a really cogent sketch of exactly the kind of specialized problem set that the mediators 2-3 decades ago wasn't even on their radar. And now that we'd require that mediators and their teams have some fluency in to be effective in that process. Turning to you, Meredith, you've spent the bulk of your career on the African continent, which is, of course, host to some of the most intractable and enduring armed conflicts. And your work of late has specialized in inclusion. What can you share with us about how that should fit into this evolving landscape?
Thanks, Sasha, and a huge thank you to Teresa and Zand and everybody who contributed to this volume. I of course see inclusion in everything. I think each of us that work on things, I'm sure you see that as digital, but I think across the volume you talk about these challenges, and I really like the innovation and adaptation as a dual lens of the publication. Teresa, you mentioned at the beginning this sort of notion that peacemaking is in crisis. I feel really strongly that inclusion is really deeply in crisis at this moment. And I think one of the things the volume does that's quite interesting is it does talk a lot about where we've come. Inclusion is a pioneering space, and inclusion has transformed the peacemaking landscape. It has absolutely changed the way we understand peace processes, the way we understand how civil society engages, how women engage, how we even construct a peace table has been fundamentally altered over the last 25 years. And at the same time, a lot of us, I was at the Week on Women, Peace and Security last week in New York, which I know some of you were at, we also sort of feel like we're nowhere. And so there's this moment of real crisis and dilemma where we have a suite of evidence showing that inclusive approaches does lead to more sustainable agreements, that inclusion of women, of civil society, of youth, of other marginalized actors helps to solve problems that the mediators are facing, can help to bring the parties together, can help to find new spaces, and can engage in a lot of the multi-mediation spaces that Christine Bell talks about in the volume. But at the same time, why aren't we seeing that leading to these bigger transformations? And at the Global Center for Pluralism, we try to take a slightly sort of different frame when we think about inclusion. So we don't work specifically on, say, the women, peace, and security angle, or youth, peace, and security, or a single angle, but really to say, how do we understand how diversity is expressed in a society in conflict, and then how do we understand how that's impacting the conflict, and how would you construct a peace agreement or a peace process differently in order to engage that, and therefore who does also need to be engaged in that process, possibly through a multi-mediation approach rather than necessarily being at the table, if a table even exists. But at the same time, and I think some of the work in the volume on this I really like, is that we do see continued, not just resistance to inclusion, but a lot of the original strategies that we have devised are in some senses no longer fit for purpose. So when we began some of this work at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue more than 20 years ago, we talked about women at the table. But what if there isn't a table? Or what if the table has been moved? What then do you do? I was speaking with a peacemaker from Yemen, a woman peacemaker from Yemen last year, and she said, I feel sometimes like our conflict is being fought, but it isn't about us. And if it isn't about us, where do we fit when we push for this kind of inclusion? And we see this obviously when we see the transnational nature of so many of these conflicts, and I think Sudan is a great example of that. But within this sort of this crisis moment that I'm laying out, I think there are real opportunities for us to learn about what has been a success and what has worked, and where we can take some of that forward. And so just hearing a little bit, when you were talking about principles and so on in mediation, I know that there's a lot of discussion about international norms and how we need to push forward a lot of these norms. I think one of the really strong arguments around inclusion and practicality in these spaces is that it's practical, that it helps you get things done, and that it isn't necessarily about, I know this might be an unpopular opinion, it isn't about equality of women. It's about that women can get these things done for you, that they can maybe cross a line when you need lines to be crossed when you're discussing ceasefire modalities. They can engage in different ways, they can bring different things to the table, and that some of that practical conversation needs to happen. And when I think, for example, about some of the work that we've done in different spaces in Sudan and others right now, what we're seeing is that there is actually a really pragmatic approach to the need for inclusion. In the civilian leadership right now, coming together under Tagadom and other civilian coalitions for Sudan, there's a really pragmatic recognition that they need to be inclusive to be credible. And they need to be inclusive if they're going to actually engage with all of these, with all of the challenges that they're facing. And they need to be geographically inclusive as much as they need to be inclusive of women or of youth and so forth. So I think that there is space for us to talk more about some of these pragmatic advantages of inclusion in this moment. But to do that, I think we also need to engage much more with, and I'm conscious, I don't like the term emerging actors in mediation, new actors in mediation. I know you said China's newer. There's a lot of these actors that have been working for a really long time, and I think we need to understand better the sites of resistance to inclusion in these spaces. Sometimes there's maybe a feeling that the table is narrower, and therefore these things don't necessarily matter. I think there's a lot more that can be done to really try to engage in some of those discourses, not with a normative frame, but really trying to understand and see where some of these inclusive pieces can come together. I have a few examples I'd be happy to speak a little bit more on, but I might just conclude specifically talking about Sudan. And one of the other things that we've really learned from a number of the larger movements that are ongoing right now, particularly the Sudan Youth Network, which we have been engaging a little bit with. And one of the lessons that they're really pushing is the importance of really understanding that when we try to approach inclusion, this cannot just be about numbers and representation, where we bring a few people in. You cannot add women and stir, add youth and stir. You can't bring a few people and think that you've therefore done your job. That's a rote learning sort of approach to a very complex problem. And the Sudanese youth have been saying many, many times to me, you have to protect and respect the fragile internal cohesion that we are trying to develop right now as Sudanese in the midst of an incredibly polarized environment. And you have to take that as your starting place when you want to build something inclusive. And I think for us as external actors, that's really, really important to remember, because there is an intersectional identity and a series of identities at play, and we need to respect that. We need to understand that there needs to be negotiation within these spaces before they're necessarily, or contiguous with them necessarily being involved in a mediation process. So I think one of my real takeaways, especially in this last year, in these huge crises of inclusion, is really that question of being led and driven by some of the really phenomenal social movements that are emerging in Sudan and elsewhere in the world in some of the toughest circumstances, and really recognizing that they are developing this internal cohesion, and then we can be very delicate about how we draw that in and find creative ways to ensure that those voices are adequately represented at every table in a multi-mediation space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I think your remarks really get to the core of one of the most vexing questions that we're all grappling with here, which is, as mediation changes as a practice, what norms should we be trying to preserve and usher into this new era? And what your remarks make me ask myself is, are we even doing a disservice to those ideas by framing them as norms? And is there more value in thinking about it through the lens, as you were saying, as practicalities or functionalities? So hopefully we'll get a chance to explore that a little more in the Q&A. Tyler, from where you sit at the State Department, one of the functions of your unit is very much to take the lessons that we've learned over generations of doing mediation and peacemaking, and make it real and applicable to inform policymaking in the government. So from the perspective of a policymaker, could you share with us some reflections on how some of the ideas that have been surfaced today can be actioned or incorporated into government decision making?
Absolutely, thank you so much. And I could really nerd out on everything that we've talked about here today and all the aspects of the Accord publication. Thanks so much, Sasha. Thank you, USIP, for hosting. I'm so happy to be here with CR and the insightful authors of the Accord publication. First off, I'm an advisor in the State Department's Negotiations Support Unit, or NSU. We're housed in the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And the NSU, we're a new creation. We started in 2021. And really what we are is we are a team of experts on peace process and complex negotiations. And we have years of experience as practitioners on negotiation, agreement implementation, and long-term reconciliation. And as Sasha mentioned, one of our core purposes is to ensure that the U.S. is adapting to new advances in the field, as is highlighted so well in this report. The NSU, the way we operate is we provide by request tailored support to U.S. diplomats engaged in peace processes and complex political negotiations. We advise on policy, strategy, and programs. It's important to note that the NSU, we are a swing capability. We respond to on-demand requests from diplomatic leads. This means that we don't engage on every conflict. We're a relatively small unit, so that's a good thing. Instead, we engage where the department and interagency sees a unique need for us. So I really want to thank Teresa and the authors of this report. The list of contributors and even the folks here and named today, it reads like our contact list at the NSU. We often ask the folks who are authors of the various components of this report for their insights and ideas on a range of negotiations issues that we face every day. And while I'm here as a part of the State Department's Negotiation Support Unit, I come from this community of practice, and so I'm excited to be part of the conversation. So much of our field has changed, not just in the last decade, but in the last 3 years. And that fact alone makes this publication required reading. Zan mentioned that he hoped that it's useful, and it is. I can assure you it is from a policy and practitioner standpoint. And those of you in the audience who are students, practitioners, or diplomats who are about to begin on a portfolio that may include a peace process, you should read this first to understand the global state of play, the pitfalls and opportunities. Of course, we can learn from doctrinal teachings on negotiation and mediation and the case studies from the 1990s and 2000s, but the way it's done today is fundamentally different than it was even a decade and a half ago. And this volume, it really captures that change, and it's so important and timely. So a big theme in the piece is the diverse range of state-level actors, NGOs, and international organizations, and how they all play a unique role in conflict resolution. And the new thing is that there's no default hierarchy, and that's something that we are adapting to in this new context. Sometimes we're faced with overlapping and at times competing fora for talks. But rather than fight this, we're learning to work within it and find opportunities, which is one of the great recommendations in the piece. Of course, state-level actors like Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, Kenya, Switzerland, Norway are increasingly consequential, and in fact, they're all juggling multiple processes at one time. In addition, you have the unofficial mediators also playing a major role. You have insider mediators local to the context, private organizations, NGOs, and these unofficial or sort of non-state, non-international organization actors, they can operate where us states and multilateral organizations can't. And they can tap into different networks, and they can try new things. And even with the return of state-on-state war and high levels of geopolitical polarization, this emerging, sorry to use the phrase, but this, like you mentioned, it has existed for a while, but this field of mediation actors is still able to get things done. The new way, or as Christine Bell, as we mentioned, calls multi-mediation, has produced successes, right? But many of those successes have been in managing consequences of conflict, humanitarian deals, confidence building measures, and things like that. But effective mediation, as we know, isn't just about managing the consequences, which we need to do, but it's also about addressing the root causes and meeting the needs of impacted populations. And so while many things have changed, those two things have not, and that's one of the principles that we talk about here. And we also can't diminish, we've talked about these different actors, but we can't diminish the essential role of the United Nations and other international and regional organizations. And the UN is working to adapt to these new realities as well. Teresa and her co-authors they've provided plenty of approaches and examples that can pull from capacities in our new environment. And the goal, our goal, right, is to develop inclusive, multi-stakeholder engagements leading to sustainable peace. And we appreciate all the authors of this publication in their embrace of the collaboration, right, between the diverse mediators and actors, because they draw on the different sources of legitimacy, capacities, and relationships. That's probably the biggest takeaway that we have taken in our engagement, based on the findings and the conversations that we've had with the authors over the last few years. So I'm hopeful that we can focus these energies on approaches that do uphold core international norms and build sustainable peace. One of the benefits of this new way, of the multi-mediation way, is that we can keep working a problem, right? So if one mechanism or process stalls, we can look to other tracks and other efforts and keep certain parts of the conversation going, even when other parts stall out or reach impasse. And so moving forward, it's crucial, and we learn this from experience and from the recommendations of this paper and through consulting with people in the field of practice, is that we do need to continue to build our trusted relationships with the diverse range of actors and partners in this context. We need to remain aware of our strengths and weaknesses. We need to maintain our independence and our values in these processes and adapt our approaches so that they meet the need of conflict parties, impacted communities, and the evolving geopolitical context. So finally, we're just so grateful for the authors of the publication, not only for what you've written, but for being open to consultation with us at different times. So thanks.
Thanks, Tyler. You make a great case for why the volume is required reading, and I'm sure Zand and Teresa and the other authors are heartened to know that not just in cubicles across the District of Columbia, but in capitals around the world, policymakers are turning to resources like this publication to inform their thinking as they try and work through some of these really complex problems. So our speakers have put a lot to chew on our proverbial table here. So I think what we'd like to do now for our final 30 minutes or so is give a chance to anyone in this room to ask their questions. We have two runners, Mihira and Daniela, that are holding microphones. So anyone that has a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. I'd encourage you to introduce yourself, and we will be giving bonus points to anyone that concludes their remarks with a question mark.
Thank you. I'm Peter Kovac. I'm a semi-retired U.S. diplomat and one that's worked several times in whole-of-government strategic communications. My question is, with these well-intended mediation efforts and an increasing variety of players, are there some structures where there was coordination with military and national security strategy elements involved that kind of were good examples for how to succeed in a multi-mediation? And conversely, are there some examples of where a good effort, a good faith effort was sort of sabotaged by chaos in coordination? Thank you.
Well, chaos and coordination is certainly something that many on this stage, I think, are familiar with. As the editor of the volume, I think I might give Teresa the first crack at tackling that question, but anyone on the panel is welcome to come in with remarks or reflections.
Thank you. A good question, but it really, it highlights the challenges that many governments have, and particularly large governments, speaking in this town, of internal coordination. And I think it's not something that we address specifically in the volume. And those of us who come more from a multilateral background are very familiar with the challenges of coordinating across the UN system. I do think that there's a kind of the area where I see the area of lack of coordination that comes forward most obviously to me at this moment is the kind of many governments who may come out, and we see it kind of across difficult contemporary conflicts, and I'm thinking of Gaza particularly, of governments which come out with an express goal for one set of actions, which might be peace, and this isn't just Gaza, but peace in Sudan is another example. An express goal for one outcome, which might be a peace process, a ceasefire, and then a sustainable political settlement. And then another part of the government, or but a greater priority is given to other concerns, be it economic interests or strategic relationships with key actors who might be fueling conflicts because they are needed for other reasons. And this is the problem, and I think that's where you see whether it's a sort of chaotic lack of coordination or just that big governments will have multiple goals in a given theatre, and some of them are more weighty than other goals, and so they trump kind of political decisions about conflict. And unfortunately, in this, and this is where the whole question of states engagement in all states engage in mediation or peacemaking as an expression of their foreign policy. Why shouldn't they? It's an entirely normal thing. Some states have a small neutral state like Switzerland has the luxury of having a formally neutral foreign policy, even if it's been challenged by events in Ukraine, or Norway, which is rich enough has its own resources, so is fortunate to be small and wealthy and far away from many countries, so they can engage in mediation in a way that in certain places they're able to engage with impartiality and with a tradition of peacemaking behind them, but it's still part of their foreign policy interests. Other states engaging in more complicated entwined conflicts, the foreign policy interests will be predominant, and it leads to a kind of lack of coordination in how they might respond to thinking about peace.
Thank you. I'm making meaningful eye contact with the panel so that someone can signal if they have a burning addition to this point. But otherwise, I'll turn to our next questioner.
Thank you. My name is Mark Friedley. I'm from the Embassy of Switzerland. So we're very happy to have this cooperation with USIP and also to have contributed to this publication. I have a question on the use of tech, or the role of tech in mediations, which is very interesting, especially if we think about that lots of tools that are on the table, in the end, they're managed and created by the private sector. And so when we think about multi-mediation, we've talked about NGOs, state actors, but we haven't really talked about enterprises. And I mean, I think Starlink is a really, really striking example in Ukraine at the moment of how much leverage actually they have for the success of the war effort. And I mean, not even talking then about once there is a mediation of peace. So what are your experience or your insights when it comes to the role of the private sector and some of the difficulties you may have encountered and how they play along or not? Thank you so much.
Sean, I dare say you're going to be first at bat for that question.
So it's an excellent question. It is a point we also address at the end of the article, but when we talk about all three of these categories of technologies, it's dealing with the private sector is probably inescapable, right? The social media companies run social media platforms. We talked about network operators and telecommunication companies are obviously implicated by both shutdowns, but also kind of can be the transmission mechanism, if you like, for cyber attacks or offensive cyber operations. And, you know, as you, I think, allude to in your question, the private sector is, you know, a set of actors that mediators are often not that comfortable or well-versed in dealing with, but I think quite inescapable in this context. So in the piece, I think we make 2 points. The first is, in that decision with the conflict parties about whether or not to place these issues on the agenda, there should be a conversation about is it necessary to also engage with the private sector to kind of achieve whatever outcome you're trying to negotiate? And if so, under what circumstances, right? And it can be, particularly when we're talking about operators and technology companies, quite sensitive, you know, given that obviously companies are headquartered and based in certain countries, and that kind of opens a lot of questions, including about things like supply chains. But to hone, you know, in sort of very tightly, for example, on the social media companies, there is a very large, I think, ongoing discussion and debate in the peacemaking and mediation field about how to work with social media, if and how to work with social media companies in peace processes. There are certainly sets of behaviors which, perhaps unfortunately less so over time now, but which would be of interest in kind of negotiations on a peace talk, in a set of peace talks, which would also likely be violations of the terms of service of social media companies. So there might be some role in speaking to those companies about enforcing those standards. One could also see, you know, in an actual peace agreement, perhaps the parties agreeing to undertake a joint representation to social media companies to try to monitor behaviors that aren't formally part of their community guidelines, right? And their standards. Or to devote more resources, as they sometimes do, for example, around electoral processes, to content moderation and or upranking kind of more healthy content in conflict situations. So one could see that type of interaction. I will say there's a lot of concern from digital peace building organizations that it's been very difficult to have those conversations with social media companies, and that they've sometimes felt those conversations are quite extractive, and that the companies are kind of seeking information, but they're not getting much in the way of policy change coming out of them. And if I can say, actually one more thing comes to mind. The other part of those conversations have been both, in some cases, this happened with the UN mediation in Libya. The UN mission was kind of designated as a trusted partner by Facebook, so that its sort of content about the mediation process would get upranked sort of in the social media sphere. And other NGOs and digital peace building actors have also approach social media companies about steps like that in terms of being trusted content partners.
Very interesting. Yes, we have another question.
Thank you so much. My name is Saeed. I'm a journalist from Afghanistan. The United States negotiated with the Taliban for over 2 years, and the outcome of the peace talks led to a complete disaster. Today, there is a complete gender apartheid in Afghanistan, and the women and the girls, they have been marginalized totally. And even they have lost their fundamental rights to education. At the same time, some regional powers like China and Russia, they are trying to whitewash the Taliban at the cost of the lives of millions of Afghans. I want to ask the experts that how we encourage the policymakers and the governments to negotiate a win-win peace process, not one-sided. Thank you.
I think a handful of you could potentially come in on this one. Maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I was just in Beijing for a dialogue with the Chinese on the issue of Afghanistan. I think for them, the issue has moved beyond mediation, right? It's already settled. Taliban has already taken over the country. So it's no longer a conflict mediation case. It's more of a case of engagement and how to, well, if there is a normalization of relations in the process. And the Chinese approach has also been a regional one. It's not a unilateral engagement. It's, well, you probably remember the Tunxi initiative where the Chinese invited all the neighbors of Taliban to come together. So I think they call it the four ministers meetings of Afghanistan's neighbors. So that's the Chinese approach. And I pushed them pretty hard on the question of, well, what is the priority here? What about the protection of civilians? What the protection of women? And the conversation comes back to the same point that the women's issue is not the origin of the conflict in the country. And I think they do recognize, well, there's no illusion that they do recognize, well, this is quite backward. And this does not represent the modernity that the Chinese believe in. But they also recognize, well, this is reality on the ground. So what are you going to do? Are you going to completely shut them out of the society, out of the international community, and therefore also throw away the opportunity for engagement? Or you start with engagement and see what you can change in the process. Not to say that which one is right or wrong, but I think that's a more practical approach, at least in their view. And I think there's really no illusion that when they look at how, for example, Afghan Taliban treats women and treats women's education, there's a lot of criticism, even inside the Chinese society. Remember, the Chinese still have a All China Women's Federation that's supposed to represent all the women in China. So there's a lot of criticism of how China is engaging Taliban, and China has included the Taliban ambassador in the diplomatic corps in Beijing. But I think it comes back to the point of pragmatic approach, and also what is the alternative? And does the alternative brings a better result? You can refuse to engage them, but they will keep the same policy. And at the same time, you are nurturing or creating a regional source of instability and potentially further Islamic radicalization, which the Chinese don't see as in their interest. So I think the engagement with Taliban has a lot of selfish incentive from the Chinese approach. But on the other hand, I think they see a logic to it. And they also, well, it's also funny when you compare how the Chinese see Afghanistan and Pakistan today. The conclusion is, well, Afghan Taliban is actually aiming for economic development. And they actually have a plan, and they're working on a plan. They send out their economic engagement letters like in different languages on a weekly basis. And when they look at Pakistan, they're like, well, Pakistan is going through an Afghanistanization. That's actually is going backwards. So again, I feel that mediation has to, at least in the Chinese philosophy, when I analyze their approach, pragmatism is sometimes the overall consideration above a lot of other considerations. Not to say that it is correct, but this is their way, this is their approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Yoon. Meredith, I wonder if we can bring you in on this too, because as you mentioned, the Chinese logic on this is if it wasn't a driving force of triggering the conflict, then why would it be a prerequisite to coming to the table around it? And when we look at the contemporary Doha process between the international community and the Taliban, we know that one of the things the UN, as the convener of this process, has struggled with is figuring out how to thread that needle, how to walk that line, and what we should be demanding of the Taliban in exchange for being at the table and looking at potential further engagement. So I'm wondering, through an inclusion lens, how do you see this question?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's several things I would say. First of all, I would say that we're in the situation now because of a failure of inclusion in a whole bunch of processes. We could go back to Bonn and others, and failure of engagement in that space, and maybe also to bring it back to the earlier question about coordination with military and defense and security. I think this might be an awkward thing to say in Washington, D.C., but I think that there was definitely U.S. interests working at cross purposes with one another for many, many years in Afghanistan that led us to a space where peace talks were happening and other things were countering them coming out of the same administration. And so we were already, I think, in this huge mess. I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the challenges now is that you're in a non-mediated environment, right? The view of the Taliban is there's peace in the country and we're the government. So why would we be engaged in peace talks, right? So that becomes around things like recognition and so on and so forth. In terms of how to push to get women's voices and to get these issues on the table, I would say that something doesn't have to be the root of the conflict to be important to its resolution. And so I think that a singular thread like that is maybe too linear and simplistic an understanding of any conflict, let alone this one. So I would say that. The second thing around engagement of women, engagement of civil society in the talks that the UN has been facilitating, I note, of course, there was concern when the meetings happened over the summer and women in civil society weren't engaged. I know there's an example in one of the papers in the volume around Mandela's mediation when women weren't at the table, and him meeting with the women in the evening and then taking all of the women's points and making them the next day in the party saying, "Oh, fabulous, Madiba, thank you so much." And he was simply repurposing them as himself and advancing some of those issues. I think there's a lot more. That's not ideal. Of course, we don't want that. But I think there's a lot more that a lot of us could do. An Indigenous colleague of mine in Canada often says to me that it's your responsibility. If you are able to access spaces that I can't, it's your responsibility to take these messages in there. And I think that's all of our responsibility, and I think that that's really what needs to happen. But one thing I would also just ask, because I'm really curious, I heard a Chinese official saying one time to Taliban officials, you can't have economic development if half of your population isn't engaged in that economic development. And so I really do wonder, I mean, I think to this point of pragmatism, I think there is a pragmatic argument around that space. But we also do have to tread carefully. We can call for education of women and girls, but education for what? If you end up with madrasas that are teaching a certain form, that's not the education you mean. So all of these things need to be done really delicately, which is why I really go back to the lessons that Sudanese youth will say and others is really we have to also really hear the voices from the ground and what women in Afghanistan right now would say about how this needs to be advanced. And I'm conscious that there are a huge number of people now that are outside, and so you have very different voices. And it's a reminder as well when we think about inclusion that there isn't a single Afghan woman's voice. And so we also really need to understand what all of those nuances would be when we're bringing those messages forward. But I do think there's more that the mediators, the UN and others could do to find those avenues of moving that forward, and probably in coordination with China and others.
And Tyler.
I can just add one thing as well. When we got our start in Negotiation Support Unit in 2021, one of the things that we pledged to do as part of our mandate is to learn lessons, right, from the United States' previous approach to different conflicts and contexts in our engagement. And so, looking back, you can review several U.S.-sponsored comprehensive studies of what went wrong. Meredith did a great job of describing some of these in coordination of national defense actors on our mediation priorities and the importance of early engagement when the leverage environment looks much different. So, when we got our start in 21, it was one of our goals to make sure that we're looking back on these contexts and ensure that we learn from them.
Can I also have a quick comment on the question that Meredith raised? I think the Chinese, at least in their policy towards Afghanistan, they do use inclusivity or the inclusiveness of the society as one foundation for continued stability in the country. But when they talk about inclusivity, it's more about ethnic minorities and non-Pashto population in the country. It's much less about women. And I went deeper and basically challenge them that what is your logic here? That why do you not see this as a priority? Two reasons. The first one is, they see it as a non-negotiable issue from the Afghan Taliban, whether because of their, it's not really religious because they're basically the only country that does it. But it is about the conservative male dominance in the society, right? The belief that when women are educated, they're going to challenge the male dominance. And on the economic point, there was a very interesting argument that, basically in the country, there's a shortage of jobs. So it's not a shortage of human resources. It's not a shortage of labor. And one of the analysts in China, one of the top Afghanistan experts, made a point that I thought that was fascinating. He said, if there are women in the labor market, there will be even less jobs for men. And that's a really interesting logic, that which one comes first, right? And of course, then the conversation went in the direction that, United States should release all the funds and create more jobs and try to create economic engagement, but that's a non-starter, and I think they understand that.
Yeah, thank you. I believe April has a question.
Yeah, so first, thank you so much for an interesting discussion. I'm April Alley. I work at USIP on Yemen and the Gulf, but 2 weeks ago I was with the UN envoy for Yemen, working on their mediation. So I guess my first question is on the UN, and it's for Teresa. Could you reflect a little bit more on, we know the new challenges, right? It's a really difficult time for UN mediation, particularly with the council as divided as it is, and issues of mandates and other things, but where do you see the UN role in mediation going? Where is this going, and what's the best case scenario? Because the UN still provides this essential role, in many of these conflicts. However, again, we know the challenges that are evolving. So, what do you see as kind of the best case scenario moving forward? Where should the UN be positioning itself, and what needs to be done to allow it to fulfill that role in mediation? And the other question I had, really fascinating on China, is what is the extent of Chinese ambition with mediation right now, or is that still evolving? And is it more demand-driven? And to what extent are they also engaging with other mediators who have kind of the same approach? I've worked extensively with Oman, and they're also facilitators as opposed to mediators. A lot of similarities in many ways, and also the way the Gulf approaches mediation has some similarities with China. And because it doesn't come with the normative frame, in many of the conflicts, at least I'm most familiar with, the demand might increase. So, thank you.
So maybe Teresa and then Yoon, if you want to come in on the last one.
Thanks, April. A good and big question, which I'll try to answer quite briefly. I think that there are multiple different manifestations of what the UN is doing in mediation. I'm conscious that Sean is more at the rock face, because it's been a couple of years since I've been in the UN, though obviously I follow it. And there's differences between situations like Yemen, where the UN has a mandate, but even then, and I'm also conscious of Sasha, who's worked for a long time in her last job when the UN was on the Syria mission. So that there are the big processes where the UN has a mandate, and it had the mandate because everybody else was so divided that the kind of default was we're also divided, so we'll give these impossible tasks to the UN. And the three that come to mind obviously are Yemen, Syria, and Libya. And then there's some legacy ones where the UN also has a mandate, Western Sahara, Cyprus, things, and then smaller, weaker mandates, Myanmar being one of them. in all of those, even today, and even in places where in Yemen somewhere where actually the Security Council has been more united on Yemen than on most things, and the P5 continues to talk at different manifestations of it, one of the challenges for the UN is how to navigate in a kind of amidst multipolarity and amidst changing regions, and Yemen I think is a good example, but you could say the same of Libya and certainly Syria, where other actors, regional organizations, but in those cases particularly states, are coming forward and doing different bits of the mediation, so separate tracks of engagement between the Saudis and the Houthis and the Astana process in Syria, or all sorts of different rival processes going on in Libya. And so one of but the UN kind of retains, and there's still a lot of actors who want the UN to have the convening role, and to lead eventual, if the processes eventually move forward, the role of the UN in leading them towards implementation is not contested. The utility of the UN in the recent central bank deal in Libya, it's sort of an interesting example of a kind of, again, a partial thing. It's not fixing Libya, but it was an absolutely critical agreement which the UN was able to come and play a role. So it's balancing all these relationships. One thing we haven't really touched on is the UN still has a lot, the breadth of capacities that the UN has is still not matched by anything else, and the value of the UN in being able to oversee implementation and verification and kind of hang on in there for the long time with a breadth of resources. There's endless problems about coordination and chaos in those kind of resources, but the UN has those, and you see the current discussion around Haiti, where there has been this attempt at a different kind of mission with Kenyan-led. Very difficult to resource, very difficult for the Kenyans to step up to the challenge of Haiti, and now the discussions return to peacekeeping. I think that in other instances, and even in those circumstances where the UN formally has the mandate, its relationships with the other actors in the space is absolutely key. And in others, it might be into more formal partnerships. And we've seen lots of different partnerships of the UN with the AU and regional, sub-regional organizations at different moments. And so the Sudan, before the war broke out, there was rather wobbly relations between the UN and the AU, but they came together with IGAD in a trilateral mechanism, and has to be, the UN in those circumstances has to be taken seriously. So partnerships are really important. There's been an interesting feature of the Pact for the Future, which were the UN member states adopted in the recent General Assembly meeting in September, which actually specifically calls for more good offices of the Secretary General. So it's actually calling for more kind of preventive engagement by the Secretary General and those who work for the Secretary General. And it's interesting because in the past there's been, a sense of people not wanting the Secretary General to do too much, and at this moment of crisis there is this push, when it comes down to individual cases where the Secretary General might engage member states, or the key member states remain so interested in that, remains to be seen. But I think it's interesting that at this moment of geopolitical division, recognizing that the universality that the UN brings and the relationships with all states that the UN can but that the UN represents and the Secretary General has, can have a lot of use. And beyond that, I think at different levels, there's the technical resources, not just technical resources on mediation support, but technical resources on things like the police deployments, and the kind of resources the UN has to bear can provide support to other actors in circumstances where the UN might not be leading. And the UN has actually been quite effective at engaging it in different ways and at different levels of processes in a supportive way. So I think it's obviously a hard moment for the UN, and battered by the Security Council, battered by divisions in the Security Council and a kind of loss of legitimacy and pushback against many things. But actually there's all sorts of potential and ways in which a kind of reinvigorated sense of the UN, and a UN which is willing to take a bit more risks in some areas to try things for preventive engagements, or can still do a lot. Thanks.
Thanks, and we're coming up on time, but I want to let Yoon get into address the Chinese ambitions in conflict mediation portion of the question.
That's a great question. I think the Chinese are still trying to figure it out because they have had a very limited success with conflict mediation, but they do enjoy the glory. And when the Iran-Saudi deal came through, like, oh God, this is like the success of the Chinese approach to conflict mediation. And then you ask them, what is approach? It's still being defined. This relates to the earlier question about great power and the great power's role. The Chinese have something called the Global Security Initiative, and in that, they source that as the ultimate definition of the Chinese peace and mediation work. They define security as 3C and 1S, 3C common, cooperative, comprehensive, and 1S is sustainable. But what they eventually mean when this term is being applied, for example, on the issue of the Ukraine war, is that they call for accommodation of the actors that are traditionally defined as the troublemakers, right? Well, this party has grievances. It starts this crisis or starts this war because it has grievances. It's not properly accommodated by the other party. And in the case of Ukraine war, we saw that argument a lot. And the same argument being used on Afghanistan, same argument being used on sometimes even in the case of North Korea. North Korea develops nuclear weapons because it has, in the Chinese view, legitimate security anxieties that is not being resolved in any other through any other means. So unfortunately, I think there is a great power competition connotation to this. The Chinese approach is effective, whereas the US approach is not. And we've seen most of that narrative in the case of Afghanistan, that this is an example of the US failure, and also in the case of Saudi Iran, that US does not have the ability to play the role. So I do see that the Chinese see the conflict mediation in many ways through the lens of great power competition, even without their consciously knowing. And in terms of the engagement with other mediators, the Chinese engage a lot through the regional approach. Like in the case of Myanmar, they said that ASEAN should play the main role. In the case of Africa, they argue that the African Union should play a main role. China supports the African Union, the standby force, and the financing. So if there's going to be more demand, I think the Chinese will, but we also see an interesting absence by China in all the cases almost in Latin America. Venezuela, Colombia, China is just not there. They don't even have a special envoy for these crises. So I would say that the Chinese mediation is also quite selective. All the cases that they're more deeply involved in have a direct correlation to China's national interest, whether that is border security or the spread of radical Islamic beliefs on the Chinese border, or it is China's economic interest on the ground. Remember, South Sudan was because China had oil there. And in the case of the current, I would say, Saudi-Iran deal, the Chinese do have an interest in the regional peace and stability, and that constitutes another argument in the literature of conflict mediation, which is great powers are not positioned. They're not blessed to be mediators. They have too much national interest involved, which makes it impossible for them to be neutral or impartial. They want to protect their national interest one way or the other, whether it's their national interest stand alone or it is a relationship with interest vis-a-vis another great power. I think that's an interesting argument. Probably worth more exploration. Thank you.
Thank you. I noticed Zand has been taking diligent notes, which I assume are all going to inform the next volume of Accord and more issues to unpack. I could listen to all of these good folks explore these questions all day, but I know we have at least 2 parents on this stage that have young children that they need to take trick-or-treating. So we will keep it to time. I want to thank all of you guys for coming out, all of those that tuned in online for this conversation. I think we can safely say stay tuned. There will be more things to think about in this space. And I would just like to say thank you so much to our brilliant group of panelists, and particularly those that traveled from very far to be with us here today. It was a real honor, and we hope you'll come back. to USIP to visit us. And I'll just mention, I think we will have some coffee and tea outside for those that wish to mingle a bit, and we also have a fabulous exhibit on missing persons in Colombia here on our first floor for anyone that would like to explore it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.